Record. Welcome to another episode of the Public Comment Podcast, where I like to chat about philosophy and politics for critical, creative, and introspective thinkers. I've got a really cool show for you today, in my opinion, and hopefully you will agree with me. Also, today's episode is going to be a bit more aggressively experimental because I've made a couple of additions to my approach. But first, let me just tell you, so before I explain all of that, let me just tell you quickly what's on the agenda for today's Mad Fly Public Comment Podcast, as I try overly hard to sound cool and probably fail, but you never know, maybe I don't. And depending on who, after all, we live in a postmodern world, right? Where I might think X, Y, and Z, but you might think A, B, and C. On today's agenda, the ethics of compassion, the right to sufficient freedom in response to the blowback of pure freedom. And I have an interview, not on the show, but I'm looking to make political activism partnerships and work with political organizations. And so I will be interviewing with Clean Water Action New Jersey later. Though I'm a touch nervous because they have a policy that asks for legislators to ban plastic shopping bags. And while I do agree we probably want to reduce the consumption of plastic, to be honest with you, I don't agree that we should have a unilateral, all-out ban, because I would be concerned at this point in time about what the consequences of that would be on our economy. And so I just would not be comfortable jumping on board yet with that idea until I know how that's going to be less harmful economically as well. Make sure everything is working here. Podcast technology appears to be working. Cool. And the Facebook technology appears to be working. Cool. And there's some other things, I said I wanted to talk to you about. And I said that I was making some changes on this show. Yeah, so what I'm trying to do is actually establish more of a template, more structure. Yes, I do mind mapping and I do outlining prior to a podcast. However, how do I determine what it is that, what should be an appropriate topic? What should I talk about? And so I've come up with a few categories that are going to help me. Because, you see, my goal is really just to chat with you and be transparent with you about my philosophical and political thoughts. It's that straightforward. So that means I've got to have and develop philosophical and political thoughts. And so that means that I've got to come up with a conducive way of developing my thoughts and sharing with you how I'm doing that. And it's actually not very easy in the sense that my mind goes into a lot of different directions. And so trying to find a few focus points can get really frustrating for me. I mean, I've said it before, but there's just so much out there by way of media, art, books, businesses, products, possibilities. It's always been something that's frustrated me in life. I mean, it's not a bad thing. I love how much there is in the world. But what I'm frustrated by is really honing in on things day to day in a way that makes me a constructive thinker, but like, paying attention to things I need to pay attention to in life. I hate to think that I missed something I should have been contemplating. That's why it's important for me to play the news every day, to listen to the news when I have my breakfast, to have it on in the background when I eat dinner, and that's why I have Rachel Maddow, Lawrence O'Donnell, and Brian Williams on when I'm in bed, also sort of reading at that time too. And that's a thing because I sort of go in and out between making sure that I pay attention to the news, but having a sense of a reading life as well. And a life in which I'm contemplating other things, listening to podcasts, watching movies. I want to say hello to those who have come to stop by the way, and say that, of course, anybody with a thought, I am going to try to integrate, a sense of dialogue as much as possible here. So anybody, anyone who has a conversation starter or like a response, something I'm saying, obviously I want to hear from you. Like for example, my good friend Tim Moran has joined. Tim and I have been friends for a mad long time. It's ridiculous, since we were like 13. I don't know, Tim, is there a way for you to like video in on this? Because that would be very cool. Tim is a genius. He's an actor, he's a director, he's a writer, and has been a dear friend of mine since we were 13. We met at Tomato Patch Performing Arts and Visual Arts Summer Camp. Anyway, I did say we were going to talk about some of these philosophical ideas. Oh yeah, and I'm integrating things, right? So I am trying to... So I've got some categories here. That is like things that I've said to myself that I'm going to include in how I sort of do my mind maps. Here are the 4 categories. Products, services, media I want to share. So, if I watch an interesting movie, an interesting news clip, if I'm reading an interesting book, if I'm listening to an interesting podcast, even social media. So if there's been an interesting conversation that I had on Facebook or Instagram or what have you, then I'll bring that up and sort of go where that needs to go. Indeed, it's conversations I had with William Scott Smith, who's a Facebook friend of mine, on libertarianism versus social democracy, and egoism versus compassion. That's a major inspiration for today's content. The second category is life improvement efforts, or, my personally applied philosophical actions. In other words, I'm looking for, I'm trying to examine, like, what do I actually do to make my life better? And I want to be open about that because I like talking about it. And obviously would like to, I enjoy the conversation. So, like, for example, I'm obviously improvements that I'm making is, trying to make money on public comment podcast. And I'm trying to make it a better presentation. So I would therefore have conversation with you about what I'm doing on that end. I'm trying to loosen up. I really am. Trying really hard to loosen up. I tried so hard to loosen up today that I went on camera, live, without having yet done my hair or shaved, hadn't finished my coffee, and I put on a British accent and a German accent, which I was utterly petrified to do, but I did it because I was inspired by Howard Stern to loosen up, and Michel de Montaigne. Two perhaps unlikely, an unlikely duo, you might argue, but you combine those two and you have for an interesting personality. And I'd like to think that's moi. Yeah. Also, concepts I'm working to clarify. That would be the third category of things that are informing these mind maps that I create, these outlines to guide how I chat with you in these podcasts, which now streaming live on Facebook, because it will increase my exposure. I mean, let's not have any, this is marketing. Yeah, so concepts I'm working to clarify. Other concepts I'm looking at include rights. What is a right? For example, what is compassion is another one. Can we think in terms of degrees of freedom when we think about policy and ethics? That's some conceptualization I'm contemplating. Practicality. What is practicality? In terms of like actually living life, practical philosophy, things like that. And number 4, other topics that I have on my mind that I just don't necessarily get to. And I don't have an immediate example just yet. So the first thing that I want to talk to you about now that I've presented that to you, is I want to talk to you about that conversation I had with William Scott Smith. And I'm gonna do him the respect here. I think I'm gonna put a comment here. Hashtag WM. How do you tag him? William Scott Smith. Responding to your comments here at 13:19. Okay, just so he knows. But did his name tag? Yeah, okay. The complexities of navigating the social media life. A lot of things I chat with William Scott Smith about. Our friendship goes back quite some time. We met, I think, in a Facebook group for people interested in the objectivism ideas of Ayn Rand, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, back in probably 2012, I want to say. So I guess you could say I've known the fella for about 7 years through Facebook, and we've Skyped sometimes, and we've had some good discussions. I met him when I was very much, though, still a libertarian, and not anymore. But I wanted to respond to some of the things William Scott Smith said in our conversation. So I'll just read to you a few things he said. I'll read to you what I said, and then I'll read to you what he said back, and then I'll tell you some more logical analysis and philosophies, some conceptual thinking I've done beyond that to bring more substance to the debate we've been having, make it a little bit more intellectual and official and academic. So, William Scott Smith says, nefarious intention is often what goes along with the welfare state, as there is no more innocent or benign appearing way to increase the size, scope, and power of government. However, there is nothing compassionate about fostering dependency of the state. He adds, and there is nothing contradictory in thinking that individual liberty and freedom offers people the best opportunity and chance for success to achieve independence from that same oppressive entity. I'm going to stop there because I immediately disagree with him, and I'm going to pick it apart from there. He says there is nothing contradictory in thinking that individual liberty and freedom offers people the best opportunity and chance for success and to achieve independence from that same oppressive entity. Here's why I disagree. I call it the blowback of pure freedom. the blowback and imperfection. And imperfection. I'm typing these things out. Those of you who are listening. The blowback and imperfection of pure freedom. What does that mean? Because that's what this comes down. That's William Scott Smith's mistake, and that's the mistake of many libertarian thinkers. They have this, like, as I understand it, a sort of overly idealistic view of freedom. To them, it sounds as if pure laissez-faire freedom is like God, or is like this divine light, or is like this perfect, or morally perfect thing that you can't contradict. It's almost like a fundamental epistemological principle for them. Like, there is no logic, there is no true or false. Everything starts with just, do I get perfect, unfiltered freedom, or do I not? If I don't get that imperfect... Ayn Rand wrote a really good essay on this, on her criticism of libertarianism. That's what makes Ayn Rand really interesting. She was actually not, in the most technical sense, from her viewpoint anyway, a libertarian, because her concern was that libertarianism as a philosophy sort of has no real sense of ethics, and instead is sort of just dogmatically laissez-faire. And I mean, that's her take on it. But my point just being that treating this sense of like absolute freedom as a godly or divine first principle of proper ethics, of proper thinking, as a basic principle, to me, that just doesn't make any sense. There is blowback to pure freedom, first of all. And what's a really good example of that? I mean, it's pretty cut and dry. If you say, for example, there should be no government, you would have anarchy. And you can't have a government on a purely voluntary basis. You need a democracy. You need a democracy to work. You need people to invest time and energy in doing that. You need to pay them. So you have to have taxation in order to even have any sense of order. Forget the question of like what our basic political principles should be beyond that. But there is a case for government in general. And there's a basic contradiction immediately with pure laissez-faire libertarianism, because it wants to have things both ways. It wants to say that you cannot cause any form of coercion or force or any violation of my absolute freedom except the government to protect it, essentially. And that, to me, doesn't really make any sense. That's a contradiction. That's an absolute contradiction. So let's go back then. I mean, let's go a little bit more fundamental. Let's go deeper. I say, anyway. And I'm going to take the cap off of this mug. Hey, why not? I love my freaking coffee. Do you love your freaking coffee? Not addicted to it though. I went yesterday for most of the day without any coffee. I just had it in the morning. Usually I just have my coffee in the morning. Sometimes, again, later in the morning, early afternoon, I have another one. What about you? Good stuff. Ethics. Ethics, ladies and gentlemen. Ethics. That's what's next. That's where we go from there. Ethics. Thriving. And health is the basis of ethics. Enter. Okay. Sorry if that's jarring for those of you who are listening to the podcast version after the fact that this has been live recorded. I do apologize. I'm trying to type things into the live Facebook stream so that people can just sort of follow where I'm going a little bit and promote it. I don't know if that works, though. I don't know if that does anything. So maybe that's a waste of my time. I don't know. But I was just typing something and trying to be compelling and self-promotional. But maybe I went too far there. I apologize. As I understand it in life, I think I said this yesterday. I probably say it a lot. But it seems to me you're probably in one of three states in life. You're probably either in a state of thriving, that is, doing things pretty much to improve your state of being, or you're doing something that's self-destructive, or maybe even destructive to others. So you're either in a state of improvement, a state of destruction, or perhaps you are, for sake of conversation, more or less neutral. You're not necessarily taking superb care of yourself, but you're not necessarily masochistic or like filled with terribly unhealthy habits. So it comes back really to this idea of holistic health, doesn't it? You're either doing things conducive to holistic health for yourself and others, or you're not. I think ethics really is that simple. I don't understand why it wouldn't be. The only way it wouldn't be is if you think in terms of, well, I have a right to not be healthy. That may be true, but you are still experiencing a lack of health. And if you're causing other people to have a lack of health because of your actions, I think it's fair to call that unethical, in that you're sort of hijacking that person's soul. That which is not your soul, that someone else's you're hijacking. You're taking control that wasn't granted to you by anything other than your own bad intentions, your own destructive intentions. I mean, ethics gets complicated when you start asking about like how we come to things like should not, ought not to, versus really, again, just understanding things in terms of, I think, holistic health versus sort of holistic unwellness, or again, a sort of neutrality in where you are. So then, how do we move from ethics to politics? The question then must be, what would it be ethical for a government to do? What would it be unethical for a government to do? Or put another way, understood in an even more efficient way, we might want to ask this: what should you not be allowed to do to other people? What should you not be allowed to do? What would, put in yet another way, and this is what I wrote down, what can we deem to be an ethical prohibition on others, and why? What can we deem to be an ethical prohibition on others, and why? And to that I say there are a few things that are clearly unethical in that context. Clearly destructive things that it would be illogical to permit people to do. Number one, excessive taxation, right? So I'll do you one kindly, libertarians out there. It is certainly true that if you were to tax someone so much that they could not sufficiently pursue their own health, that would be a clearly That would be clearly an act of belligerence. That would be clearly unethical. That would be clearly something they should not be allowed to do. I call this, so as we're asking questions of rights, I call this the right of sufficient freedom. The right to sufficient freedom. That is to say, it follows, right, that it's ethical for us to enjoy our health and to pursue our health. I think Ayn Rand really established, this is one thing Ayn Rand establishes well in sort of understanding a case of like, why should you be permitted to exist? And why do we care about ethics at all and these kinds of things? Because, essentially, metaphysically speaking, physically speaking, you are you. And nothing inherently grants another person a sense of control over your life. Because nothing grants them that, except their own coercive wills. So, here we see a case for freedom in general. The question is there a degree of freedom that becomes destructive? Freedom that has blowback. For example, exploitation is a really good example of that. If you hire people and you don't pay them enough money for them to live well, then you were free, right? You're exercising the freedom to pay them only what you want to pay them. On the surface, a very overly simplified, unreasonably simplified, primitively simplified point of view, there's that sense of that freedom, except that freedom is doing people harm. Now, in a more perfect world, where it's easy lemon squeezy, I'm putting quotes in there for those of you who are just listening. It's really easy to get another decent paying job. Perhaps the concerns pertaining to minimum wage would be a non-issue, but we just don't live in that kind of world. History has proven time and time again that if you tempt people with the so-called freedom to exploit, they will. This does damage to other people because it causes undue anxiety. It causes a damaging lack of resources paired with anxiety, inability to like basically take care of oneself at times. Plus, it's metaphysically degrading to view another human being as not worthy of like living in a way that is sort of basically okay. You know? That's degrading. That's insulting. That's anti-life. That's inherently anti-life. So exploitation here becomes clearly unethical. And clearly there's a case for saying that a kind of freedom, that's a blowback of freedom, pure freedom, is exploitation. It does harm to other people. Negligence is another one. If you are overly negligent of other people's suffering, that negligence is a contributing factor to sort of pool of well-being that leaks onto other people. What would be a really good concrete example of that? I mean, let's keep it, let's think about look at something like, unemployment insurance is a really good example. If you know that there are people out there who don't have work, who can't find work, and for a variety of reasons, and maybe they're suffering from something psychologically, maybe they haven't had the proper education, I don't know what it is, they can't find work, and you just don't care. You're sort of you're indifferent to the suffering of others, and your negligence, the opposite of your negligence would be you're caring and contributing to some act of improving it. Well, that's where we see a case for, taking a little bit of your money so that people are taken care of. Again, on a really basic level, I'm not talking about thoroughly funding every aspect of every person's life. But on the other end of things, and this is why we really do need to have a balanced understanding of capitalism. Just like I was saying, excessive taxation on the part of the government is really akin to the hoarding, exploitation, or negligence of the private sector. They're similar concepts of people making excessive grabs of other people's resource. Keeping in mind, ladies and gentlemen, that there's really no such thing at the end of the day as metaphysical private property. There is only, because first of all, God doesn't hand this to you and say, you own this. You're kind of, speaking metaphysically, whether or not you believe in God, right? Even from a natural law perspective, which a lot of religious people adhere to in ethics, even in that case, on this time, when you have this time spent on this earth, nature, at best, lends you things, lends you properties. All so-called property is at the end of the day some kind of lease. Metaphysically speaking, that's a metaphysical fact. You can't contradict that because it's true. There is no such... Nothing is eternal. Goes all the way back to Heraclitus. All things change, including the state of you possessing something. Therefore, your possession of something is a lease that is thrust upon you by perhaps the chance of nature and physics, what have you. In that case, we have to appreciate the fact that resources are not to be... There is no case for excessive selfishness of resource to the detriment of others when considering the consequence of those who are severely wanting in resources. Because the resource isn't yours by virtue of metaphysical possession. It's yours out of practicality. And that comes back to my argument in favor of what I call a right to sufficient freedom. That is to say, it's logical to argue that as nature has leased you this property, and as there could be some legal protections for you to keep this property while you are on this earth, because without some private property, you can't live well. You can't be creative. You can't have a sense of consistency in life. You can't have a sense of self. You can't have privacy. You can't be wealthy. And I'm not saying there is a certain... You should try in life, right, to make as much money as you want and can without hurting other people. So you do have a right to seek out wealth. There's nothing wrong inherently with that. But only to a degree which is reasonable. That doesn't amount in a severe deficit of resources to others, which is where you look at, when you think about and understand how corporations have behaved going back to about the 1960s, when all of a sudden the unions started to experience a downfall and CEOs and the tops of corporations started keeping more and more and more of their profits and started sharing it less. And in so doing, caused the huge descent in reasonable distribution of wealth that has caused the kind of problems that, frankly, President Donald Trump and the nationalists around the world are thriving off of politically today. I mean, that just is, as far as I understand. I've got a comment from David McDermott friend of mine, a wonderful friend. We've been friends since I think 2011, and is a incredible supporter of the Public Comment podcast. He writes, in the UK, the water companies own water when it rains, so they can charge you for the sewers. This is a law. It's interesting, speaking of water, David, because I'm actually going to be interviewing today with a political organization that its sort of number one priority is water policy. So you couldn't have brought that up at a better time. As we ask ourselves, I mean, is it even ethical for any private company to own water? I mean, what is it proper? What services do we say that are proper for a government maybe to offer, and what services do we ask are proper for a private company to offer, and why? I get concerns with things like water because you just can't live without it. I mean, what if we just made pure air this product that private companies had a monopoly on and charged whatever the hell they wanted and started killing off who they didn't like because they didn't like the color of their skin or their religion or something? Scary shit, ladies and gentlemen. Pardon my language, but I believed it was appropriate at that point in time. There is something I like about I see David McDermott offers the opinion here, own water, not ethical, he says. I'm guessing by that, if I interpret you, David, correctly, what you're saying is that it should be a public utility. Am I correct? Because that's probably true. I'm not sure that anybody... Look, there's an understanding of like different kinds of products and resources, right? There are resources which we need to live, like medicine or air or water, certain necessities. There are other things that are not necessities, like what would be an example of a sort of non-necessity? This particular book, Existentialism and Human Emotions, this is not a necessity. So there's no reason for the government or anyone to demand that everybody get a copy of this book. And we need to wrap our minds around what it means to ensure that people have basic resources versus things that are more personal resources, things that are more personal interest items. Those are sort of two different kinds of categories that I think we need to wrap our minds around, and what it means to ensure that people have what they at least need in terms of a degree of welfarism that it would be reasonable for a government to find ways to provide. Now, it could be argued, perhaps, that there are instances where private industry, it would either be reasonable for private industry to compete with the government industry so that they can check each other out, or maybe there are instances where government might actually provide maybe there are cases where private industry might provide certain services better than a government could. That's a question to have. I mean, it would not make sense for a government to have a monopoly on, resources. That's communism. And that takes away any sense of, individuality, and it creates all kinds of it's anti-democratic, actually. That's a thing. That's an interesting thing to me about capitalism, which I've talked about before. Capitalism is very much, when it's regulated properly, quite like democracy, because you're voting with the power of your money. The problem is when certain people have so much clout through the power of their money that it essentially shuts down the opportunities of anybody else to have any say in the sort of democratic styled economy, if you will, for a lack of better terms. My friend David McDermott also says, the water companies should be public and have a responsibility to preserve water and be accountable to the public and government. I think that's fair, what David says. I really think that's fair. Again, water is a basic need. Without water, you die. I'll never forget when I was taking a bio class several years ago, and my professor went on having this conversation about pay attention what's going on in Syria and ask yourself to what degree is lack of water inducing anxiety that is influencing extremism as a response to that. People tempted to join ISIS because, or to pay allegiance to the Taliban because ISIS or the Taliban will offer water and other kinds of resources. A lot of people are open to gangs and thuggery and the like when they feel that such things will provide them with resources that they otherwise can't get. I think that basic understanding of gang culture has established that much. I'm not saying that poverty is the only cause for things like gang violence or evil and violence and things like that, but it's certainly a contributing factor. Think about, maybe I've said this before, but think about TV shows like Breaking Bad. What can you take as the premise behind that show? The ethical, like the established ethical proposition or suggestion of that show, if you will. The suggestion is that this guy is suffering from severe economic anxiety, understandable economic anxiety, and therefore justifies his crimes because he needs to address that anxiety. The suggestion is that it's ethical, or that people feel a sense of motivation to violate the law if it means bringing them to a place of better economic well-being. Look at immigration and issues of illegal immigration. I mean, why do you think that people go to other countries so much of the time? Why did so many people come to the United States? They came to the United States for a sense of greater economic opportunity, along with religious freedom, but economic opportunity was a major part of it. Anyone who knows their U.S. history, especially the history of the South, what was one of the biggest things about immigration to the U.S. in the southern parts of the southern states was people wanted to go and make money. Sadly, a lot of it was through slavery, and then wiping out Native Americans. These are historical facts, and quite unfortunate to the story of America. But I'm getting back to this whole point of people want resources, and people, when they are severe in their economic anxiety, do resort to violence or do resort to disregarding the law. This is the case with a lot of drug trafficking or drug dealing. You could even sort of go Nietzschean about this in a psychological sense. The idea of the will to power applied to psychology. People tend to do things that they feel will give them a sense of power, that they find empowering. Whether that coincides with reason or not is an epistemological or psychoepistemological question. But psychologically, I think we understand that people tend to be motivated by what they perceive to be in their interest. So it follows that a lot of people seem to think that violating the law, right, in today's climate, people seem to think that violating the law is a better they are willing to make the gamble. If I violate the law, I can live well, better than I believe I could, than adhering to the law or not breaking given law. And this is where we say with drug dealing or immigration. I do want to make a comment on immigration while we're at it. There has been this question of should there be a citizenship question on the United States Census? And I want to say that I think the answer is no. And I'm very troubled, in fact, in a lot of ways by concepts of so-called citizenship, because at the end of the day, we're all just people. And isn't this at the center of immigration, really? This is one reason why I get frustrated listening even to liberals on the news. I feel like one of the problems with liberals, and I think Nancy Pelosi is a perfect example of this, and why you're seeing the younger people in the Democratic Party really frustrated with the older people in the Democratic Party. Older Democrats tend not to be straightforward about what they really think and why they really think it, and the philosophical underpinnings behind things. And here's what I mean about that. Let's say in terms of immigration and issues of citizenship. At the end of the day, asking questions like even nationhood. Why do we say that you get to claim this land and call yourself a nation? And what happens with respect to the tribalism that comes with nationalism? And therefore, when you start to say to somebody else, who are you to dare come into this land, this politically organized land, how dare you come here? As if you're not a human being. It's cut and dry that President Trump and the Republicans in support of his approach to immigration, these people are bigots. There's no other way to look at it. These people who cross our borders are just human beings. They're just human beings. We're going to seriously round them up and deport them for what? For existing and crossing some line? Causing no other act of violence whatsoever than crossing a line which the law enforcement of the United States deems the United States. All of a sudden, tossing out notions of basic humanity and rounding up these people as second-class people. It's disgusting. It's really horrifying. What's happening in this country today is, with respect to immigration policy especially, is horrifying. Absolutely horrifying. I'm sickened, I'm disturbed, and I'm angry about it. Absolutely angry about it. And we really need to think about this. To say that you're not welcome into this land. Sorry. You're not welcome into this land. We've already taken too many of you. Sorry. Now get out. Or we're going to lock you in a cage and starve you to incentivize you, others like you, not to do this. I mean, we're talking about new age political violence of a sort that we have not seen in this country in a very long time. Of this kind of thing. It's horrifying, it's disgusting, it's racist, and it's inhumane. And we need to start thinking of each other as human beings and as global citizens of this earth. Now, I realize there are practical reasons and justifications at this time for nations, mostly because of matters pertaining to political ideology and protecting basic political rights. That is to say that obviously the Russian government, the Chinese government, in particular, these two particular governments, the North Korean government, these political entities are kind of belligerent. And so you have to distinguish yourself from them and organize in a politically defensive way and distinguish yourself from them, right? Speaking philosophically as we conceptualize what nationhood means. But I want to be clear though, nationhood in this context has more to do with ideology, with political ideology, than it has to do with geography or territorial aspects. It's sort of hard to describe nationhood because with all of the commentaries we've heard about nationalism versus globalism, I do not believe, if you're out there and have read something or watched something that explains the right to claim nationhood and how we distinguish ethical claims of nationhood versus unethical claims of nationhood and things like that, I would be interested in learning more about that. But it seems pretty clear to me that there's not a lot out there by way of contemplating what it means to have a nation. But I want to get this back to comments of, we were talking about ethics and sufficient freedom versus laissez-faire freedom and things like that, right? So it would follow you should have the sufficient freedom to immigrate or to migrate throughout the earth as you wish. It would be unreasonable to assume, though, it would be a little bit unreasonable not to appreciate, I think, security concerns that a country might have. There's a reason we have borders, because we do believe in certain political values such as sufficient freedom, which means sufficient freedom from violence, which means we have a certain vested interest in having a notion that as people enter our borders that they're not violent, or if we are aware that they are, that we're able to track that. So there's a case for understanding border security and national security in that context and how immigration fits into that. Fine. But then let's also look at how we treat immigrants who, for a variety of reasons, didn't coincide with what the law says. And this is where I think Julian Castro has some interesting points in talking about like decriminalizing illegal immigration. I don't know if decriminalizing is the right word, but I mean it does follow if the worst thing you did was sneak through the border and you've otherwise not harmed anybody, it's a disproportionate punishment. It's an unreasonable punishment to deport that person. It's just not it's not equal to the sense of harm that's been done. It's like filling out a form incorrectly or like a traffic violation. It's a lot like a traffic violation. Yeah, there are reasons to enforce traffic violations, and there are reasons to enforce immigration, but not at the expense of, if someone breaks a traffic law, you don't deport them. Oftentimes, you usually don't go to jail for most, maybe like, DUI, you might go to jail, but you don't go to jail for speeding. usually to the full extent of my knowledge. I mean, I used to speed a lot when I was younger. I didn't go to jail for it. They fined me thousands of dollars and made my 20s miserable. I couldn't drive for much of my 20s. I couldn't afford it. But I wasn't deported or thrown in jail. So we need to have sensitivity to this concept of, again, what I call a right to sufficient freedom, and establishing what sufficient freedom is. So those are some things by way of, that was a conversation, and that's what was inspired by that conversation. Now I want to talk to you about some life improvements that I'm striving towards. I'm trying to make this podcast obviously better, and I'm also trying to I'm trying to really think about my personality. I was telling you before that I was wanting to find a balance between like loosening up, being also very classy, graceful. I believe in these concepts: grace, eloquence, class. Trying to think, aesthetics. Essentially, there's almost like a sort of aesthetics to how we present ourselves. So I'm thinking a lot about my self-presentation and my conduct, and what it means to also just be utterly honest. Honesty is very important to me. So, yeah, I told you that I do listen to Howard Stern. I'm very interested in Howard Stern. By the way, because my friend David McDermott was kind enough to comment, for those of you who are just listening, this is what he says. Look at the eco-warriors we had over here. Mass violence, their offices and homes are always warm. A lot of offices and buildings that are paid for by someone else get the heating left on and are always 28 degrees in this type of person. I think we saw protests, that's my opinion, walk into their workplace and it's heating on even if it's warm outside, David says. David, if you want to elaborate on that, certainly would like that. So God, trying to be the right way, what it means to be the right way. I think it has to do with, I think honesty and self-honesty has more to offer than we yet even realize in terms of well-being. For example, I was telling you that I'm really interested in Howard Stern. I listen to him. I gain inspiration from him. But I don't really try to emulate him because I'm not him. And if I tried too hard to be like him, that there would be something disingenuous about it and something not helpful. I think self-honesty is about probing ourselves and asking. Part of it is like vetting what our desires are, vetting what our frustrations are, vetting what our interests are, and through this we get a clearer sense of the world. So I'm trying to be, like I said, more honest, more free-flowing, more uninhibited, and asking myself what that means. And a lot of it just means like a lot of introspection, a lot of transparency, a lot of identifying what my contemplations are, what my thought processes are. And also contemplating, one thing that I just don't know, and I need your help here, is I have no idea really how I'm being perceived. I would love your thoughts, what you guys think. I may or may not agree with you, but I realize one of the greatest, do you ever feel this way? That one of the greatest mysteries in your life is you really have no idea how others see you? I feel like I have no sense of really how other people see me. I think I've got an okay idea of how I see myself, but I'm not sure how other people see me. And I don't mean it in a narcissistic way. I really mean it almost more like in an economic way, in that by way of this product, curious how it comes across and what people are thinking about it, and to the degree which I would want to either challenge a philosophical complaint, aesthetic complaint provided, or an intellectual complaint provided, or in which someone saw something they liked and see that I can build on that. And that's frustrating, trying to navigate through that. But all you can do at the end of the day is just be yourself, right? So that's it for the day. I have made my mark, said what I want to say, really. See if there's anything else that I absolutely needed to get off my mind for the day. That I absolutely need to say. I guess you could say it was important for me to talk a little bit about balance. I find balance very difficult, and I just want to get that out there because I am really frustrated about it. And I'm not just talking about balancing a sense of like classiness and a sense of uninhibitedness and being loose. Actually, I'm talking about the balance of how much time do I spend reading? How much time do I spend watching TV? How much time do I spend mind mapping? How much time do I spend on social media? How much time do I spend delving into things like art or exercising or meditating? I actually would like to be meditating a lot more, but I just don't really tend to. The only way in which I can really experience profound meditation is by walking. Otherwise, I don't really get to feel so as meditative as I like. Your thoughts on that topic would obviously be really cool. I will close then with a comment from David McDermott, my wonderful, one of my most loyal audience members. David McDermott says, "I work as a cleaner in the evenings with Julie. The building is always hot. The employees don't pay for this. Just turn it up. Someone else pays. It is the bank. They claim it back as a cost on the expenses from their tax bill. We have a society that does not look at streetlights." Interesting, talking about the building always being hot, because that raises questions of power, energy, air conditioning, heat, and proper, two different avenues to go through this. One is the pricing of those, and the second is what is a proper source for energy as we contemplate. I think as we contemplate an end to fossil fuel and more investment in nuclear energy as well as other forms of energy like wind, solar, and fusion energy and things like that. And what can we do to move those things along in an effective way? I don't know. Those are some things that I need a little bit more education on. Except to say, I think that it is reasonable that we will be to invest a lot more in alternative energy than we already are, because we can't be dependent on oil. Forget the environmental aspect of it, because there is a legitimate concern with the environmental impact of fossil fuels. There's a health concern. I mean, I don't like breathing in crap and smoke and things like that. I want to breathe clean air. It's called health. So forget even the more complex, nuanced questions of global warming and all that stuff. I just want to breathe clean air. Is that so much to ask, man? I just want to breathe clean air. God. I just want to breathe clean air. And that would be nice. So I would rather not have all this nasty stuff and breathe it in. It's just the same reason why you don't want to sit in a pub with someone smoking cigars and things like that. It's disgusting. So we need to be working on that. I'm going to leave it there then, ladies and gentlemen. Please, feedback. Also, I want to encourage you to check me out on my Patreon page, patreon.podbean.com/public comment. That's patreon.podbean.com/public comment. Pledge what you can, donate what you can, help me make my dreams come true and become a live streaming, podcasting, thought sharing commentator of sorts. Help the public comment podcast efforts. That would be amazing, because I believe in this very deeply. I feel very good about this, and it is my hope to be able to commit to this full time, and I need your help. Special thanks to my first sponsor, the RHD PGX podcast, who is helping public comment take off and is a premier investor. And I am so very grateful for this individual's generosity in helping the public comment podcast grow and develop as it is. Ladies and gentlemen, I shall chat with you again soon. And to that end, let's